Trigger warning. This story contains kidnapping, an attempted poisoning, suicide, murder, sexual content, and betrayal. The first thing you notice about the Vignettto Club after midnight isn't the sound, it's the silence under it. The band kept a slow, horizontal groove like a ribbon of mercury. Glasses chimed against light, and laughter folded into itself, polite and expensive. But under the bass and the perfume there was a second current, the hush that settles whenever large intentions pass between people who can afford mistakes. Money taught them to keep their voices small. Power taught them to rearrange air. Being invisible had kept me alive. That night, my invisibility did more than keep me alive. It made me act. I had a rule, not much of a rule. Really, more a habit from years of slipping between tables and talk. Written on a napkin because the handwriting looked less like a decision and more like a mercy. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. 5 words, a small warning, a protocol for strangers, and sharp hands. I wrote it for a man who sat at the far end of my bar. The kind of man who rehearsed his face for public consumption. He ordered vodka, neat, in crystal, that cost more than my week's rent. He lifted the glass like someone reciting a line, and Marco, who was manning the serve that night, moved with the slow grace of someone who believed himself invisible. If you liked Tense Noir at this point, subscribe. There are worse ways to spend an evening than following what happens when secrets are offered in drinks. I noticed the small things in rows, like beads on a string. Marco's fingers came back from the bottle with a faint smear near the cap, a greasy crescent catching the light. The napkin dispenser had been refilled at 9. The top stack still smelled faintly of celery and bleach. The smell told you which supplier the club used. The customer leaned his jaw slightly to the left when he smiled, a tiny tick that meant he'd practiced smiling in the mirror. The man in the overcoat who hovered near the end of the bar had a big gray coat. Sleeves pasted in a certain way that meant it had been bought and not yet tailored, the tell of a courier or borrowed suit. There was a flash of a ring when he lifted a finger to adjust a cuff, not gold, not iron, something darker, a shadow ring with a narrow glyph engraved like a keyhole. I watched how air moved around them. It told me everything, or enough. I wrote the napkin, and I slid it across the bar with the practice of someone who'd learned to make gestures invisible by making them routine. I did not speak. The napkin landed beside the vodka, like a paper buoy. The customer read it. He smiled. He thought of the next move. He didn't move his glass away. That is where things went wrong. Lorenzo Vulov came in like winter. You don't see him the way you see other men. The room seemed to tilt to accommodate him. He did not speak loud. He did not need to. People heard his silence as the arrival of a storm. You hear about men like him in rumors, the ones with private wings in public hospitals and names that don't fit on plaques, but when he stepped to the bar he made those rumors physical, a chord taut with small, precise violence. He looked at the customer, then at Marco, then at me. His gaze slid over the napkin and lingered on my hand for the time it took someone to decide whether to buy an entire vineyard. Marco's smile went brittle. He knew, too. He had worked in this city long enough to read other men's weights. His hand darted for the back. I watch hands move like chess pieces. His was pawning itself for a simple death. I moved not because I had courage, but because my fingers had been trained to interfere without being seen. My hand pressed against the napkin again, folded it thinner, and I left it there, a small flag of interference. Lorenzo did something I'd never expected. Instead of striking Marco, instead of calling for security, he reached across the bar and plucked the napkin with a finger that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. He read the 5 words. He smiled in a way that made the skin at his eyes tighten. He said nothing. Then he lifted his head and walked away without a backward glance. 2 minutes later, police sirens would not answer the silence that swallowed that room. 2 hours later, my life as a bartender ended. They took me out the back, through an alley, rhymed with steam and shadow. Kyle opened the car door with hands the size of folded chairs. Alexi's jaw was young and flat, like someone who had learned to make decisions quickly. Franco walked behind like a punctuation mark, decisive and heavy. Someone, a thin woman in a gray coat, with hair pulled tight, Miss Petrova, had a clipboard and an efficiency that smelled of bleach and diplomacy. No one asked if I wanted to go. A hand did not lift to meet mine. No one gave me the option because options have weight in the wrong currency. They told me later that Lorenzo had come for containment. The word was clinical. They didn't use the word kidnapping because it felt like a confession to them. To me, it felt like the difference between being a bird and being a field. He wanted me moved because the little paper had introduced a variable he didn't like. The city likes predictable outputs. My napkin had produced an inconvenient output. The Rolls-Royce smelled of lemon oil and leather. The driver did not make conversation. Lorenzo sat across from me in the back, a small distance, like a cord struck and held. His suits fit like armor, not because they were expensive, but because they had been cut to make corners. His hands always looked as if someone else had reasoned them for him. You saved him, he said. Low, almost conversational. I wrote the napkin, I said. It was the truth, and not the truth. Words can be fragile things in cars that move quickly. You could have left, he said. You didn't. A man's life wasn't the point of his observation. The point was what the man with the ring meant. The point was that someone was trying to make him drink, and someone else thought of them as expendable currency. To Lorenzo, these were not stories. They were threats. He took me to a penthouse that sat on the spine of the city like a crown on a sleeping head. The elevators exhaled us into a lobby that smelled of cedar and an expensive kind of loneliness. Books lined the walls in a way that suggested someone arranged them for the angles of their spines, rather than for the count of the volumes. A large window looked over the river, which glittered like coins strung together. Someone had left a sonnet open on a lectern. Lorenzo touched the page like he was checking for a seam, then set it down with a care that suggested a practice of rituals. They called the penthouse containment in the way that places with sharp edges call things by kinder names. Miss Petrova moved with the fluency of someone who'd been trained to make people feel like they had agency while taking it away. She offered me tea in a bone-white cup that warned me with its fragility. She spoke like a dossier, precise and slow. You will stay, she said. Protection, until we understand. You will not make contact. You will allow us to ask about the evening. They took away my phone. They gave me another device with a simple interface and an imprinted number I couldn't call. They gave me a vague hospital gown for privacy and then a jacket that smelled of cedar. They changed small things because small things make people say yes. I would later learn that this was a standard. A person removed from public life becomes a better instrument when all extraneous noise is appetite for coffee is replaced with appetite for data. They preferred people who were useful. Tell me what you saw, Lorenzo said. When we were alone 1 hour after they had shut the door on the penthouse's small library, the sonnet lay where he'd left it. The mark of his thumb darkened the corner page. There was a bruise in the city that looked like the place where people hide things. I told him what I had seen. I described Marco's fingers, the greasy crescent, the overcoat sleeves, the ring. I told him how the customer smiled, like a man who had rehearsed for funerals and marriages, the same way. I spoke about how the glass had caught the light and the way the napkin had moved across the bar. I told him about the smell of bleach on the top napkins, because that would help demonstrate the time the napkins were changed. I told him about a smear I had noticed on the bottle's neck where the tiny vial had been twisted. It collected dust differently than the rest of the bottle. I told him about the way the man with the ring spoke his consonants to crisp. There was a clippedness, like somebody trained in acting or someone who'd been reading English for a few years, but getting some inflections wrong. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. He had that patient quality of people who could wait for you to reveal more than you intended. When I paused, he filled the silence with details he already knew. He had watched the club's cameras, he said, and he had images that matched my descriptions. The gray coat, the ring, the exchange at the bar. The camera frames were partial, he said, a metronome of angles. He'd had the frames cleaned and color corrected. Small decisions you didn't see till someone else told you they were there. They brought in a higher shot from the club's corner camera. The clip had the kind of grain I could smell with my eyes. The man with the ring was in frame for 1 second longer than expected. In that second he brushed the napkin as he passed. Just so, a touch like a benediction or a signature. The napkin moved into his palm. The ring caught the light. The footage was poor, the kind of thing police make reports from, But the ring had a glyph, and in one frame there was an edge of a small trade document, a folded paper peeking from a jacket pocket, and an ink stamp where someone had been careless. Lorenzo held the frame in Let's fingers, flatten it, like a lover setting a photograph back into a book. Silas Hawke, he said. The name dropped like ice into the tea. A broker of chaos, a man who dresses up industry and calls it necessity. A man who calls favors arrangements and thinks of people as ledger entries. If you were the kind of person who kept secrets, Silas was the kind who traded them in bulk. He wanted more than the name. He wanted proof. He wanted the hand that had paid Marco to be threaded back to a ledger, to an account, to a man who left himself exposed by being sloppy. You can find things most don't, he said after a long silence, as if making a diagnosis rather than a demand. You read small things. I told him the truth, that I noticed small things because I had to. My father taught me how to look when we were little, standing on creaky bar stools while he washed the same glass he had bought when we were hungry and told me stories about not being seen. He taught me to read faces like receipts. He taught me to fold my hands so they didn't look like they might take anything. When he died, the city applauded politely and went back to its business. The lessons stayed. You will help us reconstruct the night, Lorenzo said. It was not a question in the way. A command is not a question. They set up a small war room in the penthouse's study. Tablets lay in neat rows. Miss Petrova and Franco and Alexei moved around the space like instruments tuned to exact frequencies. They had a roster. Kyle, on immediate security. Kale, to shadow, external approaches. Franco, to run the field. They wanted my memory, my bar instincts, my weird ability to notice which napkins tasted of bleach. They wanted the pattern recognition of someone who lives among collectors of small differences. The first hours passed in a strange choreography. I sat on the study's low couch while Lorenzo poured tea into 2 cups he'd already decided would be mine. He filled them in silence and handed me one without looking. The steam rose and formed a small, private weather between us. Tell me again about the ring, he said. It was as if he were reading the sonnet aloud but choosing the lines that mattered. It was dark, I said. Not polished, like a shadow cut thin. There was an engraving, like a slit or a keyhole. It caught the light like a secret. Keyhole, he repeated. Good! He asked about the overcoat. He asked me about the man's gait. He asked about Marco's hands. I told him everything. The way Marco's forearm had tensed as he reached for the back shelf, the small pocket at the seam of his jacket where he kept a folded receipt that Mr. Marco used as a cheat sheet for clients who liked itemized bills. They called Marco in the afternoon a quiet boy from the wrong side of a river and asked for loyalty in dosas the size of small favors. They found Marco's body later, and the cleanup crew said it looked like a suicide. They liked neatness. The city likes tidy ends. I did not see what happened in the moments after the car took me out of the alley. I only learned of the end in pieces. A note left in a sink, a bottle that had been wiped down, frantic hands that scrawled apologies to people who would never read them. They told me the evidence called for a plea, that he had done something, that he had gone quiet, in the wrong room. The thing with deaths is that everyone sews a covering for the parts that hurt their own conscience. I learned to read people's coverings as well as their faces. Anthony Riachi appeared as a line in a ledger before he appeared as a man. Miss Petrova's people brought a spreadsheet like a prayer list, and they asked me to read it. They wanted to know who had been paid certain amounts at odd intervals. There were payments to a number I didn't recognize, transfers that ran through a shell company, and a pattern of small disbursements that suggested quiet favors. Anthony's name rose slowly out of the paper like foam does from the surface when something is boiling. Why would he do it? I asked. Anthony, the man who handled accounts, the cousin with hospital bills. The name fit the profile of someone with edges softened by necessity. People become visible to necessity, Miss Petrova said. She said it clinically as if she had seen the phrase printed on report paper. You do not get here for deeds, without a motive. They had Anthony quietly brought in the next afternoon. He came in pale, like a window scene from a rainy street. He spoke in a way that meant he was both afraid and sorry. He had debt stacked in small, steady piles. He'd been folded into obligation and thought he could thread it with favors. I watched his hands as he spoke and counted the things that didn't add up. A lie that couldn't hide in the way his thumbs rubbed each other. A phrase that repeated when he was nervous, a habit in English that clung to him like lint. It was the sort of verbal tic that makes people admit things without wanting to, the way someone says, obviously, when nothing is obvious. He confessed in a quiet, dreadful, he had made arrangements, he said, because his sister needed a surgery not covered by the polite insurance of the city. He'd slipped accounts to people like a man dealing cards when he didn't know the game. He had not meant for anyone to die, he had meant only to fix the noise. When he realized what the arrangement truly meant, he could not undo it. Lorenzo considered him as one might consider a broken clock. There was a small mercy in using Anthony's networks to go after the real broker instead of burying him quietly. In the ledgers, margins were references to boxers and addresses. In a bank transfers note there was a mistyped company name that matched a courier's invoice. The chain was not elegant, but it leaned on human error, which is usually enough for a man who knows how people flinch. "You'll help," Lorenzo said, looking at Anthony with an expression that was not pity and not respect. "The city makes a bed out of need. It expects people to lie in it." I watched Anthony leave in chains of promise he could not face. The man who had been the accountant's guilt became a resource, used to find men who trade in favors and call them business. I felt an odd thing then, a mixture of disgust and relief. The world rearranged itself in little Someone else's failure bought me a kind of leverage. I tasted moral compromise like something metallic and tried to decide if hunger or survival had a flavor I could live with. Days in the penthouse passed in a rhythm like waves. Film footage rewound and slowed as I described how someone moved his shoulders, how a napkin's corner lifted and then rested. We built a map of the club's night, like one builds a map of another country. Wrong turns, smugglers, coves, and a few honest inns. We followed the ring through pawn shops that traded in shadow jewelry and into a man who worked on the fringes of Silas Hawke's operation. The man painted his life with safe colors but left fingerprints in speech and habit. We tried a stakeout at the Orpheum, a theater on the wrong side of town where old chandeliers bled gold and the velvet coughs often when you sit in the cheap seats. I was not allowed to go in my old life. They wanted me in the van. A set of eyes on a screen. I sat with headphones and watched people walk into rows and rehearsed the way a face turns to light. They plugged me into a world I'd both inhabited and lost old rhythms of watching and made me an instrument of someone else's plan. I saw the man with the overcoat enter. I saw the hand near a pocket. I saw the ring flash like a punctuation, and then, like a trapdoor, it closed. The theater operation went sideways. A decoy, a man who looked identical in a different hat, silhouettes swapped like cards. Hawke knew how to play the camera's blind spots. He is a man whose fingers speak like bankers. He creates misdirection, the way a stage director constructs drama. After the failed operation, the city seemed louder. Waves of money ripple outward from a botched job. Teeth get set on edge. The political rumor crept in like mold. That an alderman might be in on the plan. That power could shift seats for a man willing to play clean. Alexander Rustanovsky's name arrived on a guest list like a verdict. Where politicians gather, deals are distilled into signatures. I learned to measure time by the flicker of a cigarette between Lorenzo's fingers. He became less a myth and more of a set of predictable movements for me to read. He watched me watch. I watched him watch the city. On some nights, when the sonnet lay open and empty, I would catch him reading it like a prayer, and I would see a fissure in his armor, a softness around a line that mentioned mercy, and a hand that paused as if it remembered. "Don't drink it! Smile and leave now." The napkin folded into my pocket like a talisman I hadn't intended to carry. It was not the thing that had saved the customer. Lots of variables had to line up for survival, but the phrase became a rule. It became the small ethics I'd hold like a coin. It became the barometer I used in private moments. When to resist, when to bathe a wound in silence, when to look for the face behind a negotiation. They gave me a new set of clothes one evening. A dark dress that fit like a second skin and a pair of shoes that did not bite. Miss Petrova handed me a small bracelet the color of old coins. It clicked on my wrist with a noise like a lock. "For identification," she said, "for your own safety." Lorenzo watched me with the stillness of a man holding a broken thing in his palms. He had offered me an odd calculus since the first night. Safety in exchange for usefulness. He made his deals with a lightness that was light only for the one who could bear the weight. "You want to be invisible," he said once. "On a night when the river looked like a strip of silk, you chose a life where people don't ask you to pay attention. I don't want you invisible. I want you present." "Present is dangerous," I said. "It makes you useful." Useful, I learned, meant evenings spent combing through surveillance with a pair of tired eyes and days spent reciting sonnets, not because I loved them, but because Lorenzo liked to hear someone else's voice harmonize the room. He would read a line from a sonnet and leave his fingers on the page like a question. When his fingers brushed mine, there was a little current between us that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with geography. It marked borders I had no map for. The city began to look like a chessboard again. But the pieces were not pawns and kings. They were ledgers, phone numbers, and a broken ring. Anthony's guilt opened doors for us. We found a courier with a ledger that had a smudged stamp, a courier with a particular ring pattern. We called in favors, made trades, and sat with the spectral outline of Silas, and tried to step into it. At night, I dreamt of my father wiping glasses. In the dream, he would stand on the other side of the bar and speak to me in the cadence of someone who had learned patience and how to hold secrets. He would edit my words, cut them clean. He told me once, "When I was small, don't get involved. Ara. You are a witness, not a warrior." I had never been able to reconcile his plea with the fact that, when offered the choice, I slid a napkin across a bar and made someone else see themselves as a speck rather than a world. Lorenzo is not someone who believes in soft absolutes. He believes in utility. That belief is a sharp thing that fits into the mouth of the city. When I told him I wanted my old life back, he laughed, a small laugh that meant the color in his face changed. "Your old life is a pocket of paper," he said. "There are holes sewn into it. You cannot return and keep all the pages." His face is a map where danger sometimes sits under a sigh. I did not know whether to be afraid of him or to be grateful for the edges he carved for me. Both feelings lived together like two strangers under a small roof. We kept building the chain. Ring to courier, courier to seller, seller to a set of addresses. A night of surveillance in a van behind a bakery yielded a man who fit the measurements and a conversation recorded on a phone with a crack in its case. The man mentioned a name in passing, a broker with a taste for theater, and used a phrase that matched an invoice we'd traced to a shell company. It was not it was enough. When the evidence bent toward Hawk, the whole operation sharpened. People who traffic in favors can look very clean on paper. They are practiced at washing away details. Silas Hawk was a man who understood this. He built mirrors and put them in the path of those who chased him. I was given a role that made my stomach hollow and my mind bright. I would become part of the gala plan to come. A presence on Lorenzo's arm. A translator for a speech. A woman who could read emotions like receipts. My function would be to stand where people look and not see the net under them. They told me this the night they gave me new papers and an old photograph of myself that looked stranger than any face I'd ever seen. My identity had been folded and the bracelet tightened like a slow hand around my wrist. I heard the click and felt a small, private panic, the sort you have when you realize you have lost access to the street you were born on. "Take the car at 9, Miss Petrova said. "Where's something you can move in?" I put a napkin with 5 words back into the pocket of my jacket that night because the napkin had become a litmus for decisions. Don't drink it. Smile and leave, now. I had used that sentence to nudge a man away from a poison and into a fates that uncoiled into deaths and confusion. To hold the napkin again was to remember the weight of choice. The city hummed its own language beneath the penthouse's glass. There were men who would smile and leave rather than ask why a woman had warned them. There were men who would drink no matter who said otherwise because they never thought the danger applied to them. There were men like Lorenzo who reorganized the ground beneath people so they did not fall into pitfalls he could not control. When the van left for the theater operation and then came back with a different rumor in its wake, the next plan had to be sharper. The Orpheum failure peeled another layer off the city and showed the infrastructure beneath. A politician on a guest list. A broker with a taste for misdirection. an alderman with a hand that sometimes trembled. We were moving into rooms where deals, where suits. I had a choice to make, and the choice did not feel like an offering so much as a pivot. I could stay invisible inside a jail called safety, or I could become visible in the way Lorenzo wanted, useful, present, dangerous in ways that kept me alive but cost me masks I'd worn my whole life. The napkin in my pocket felt heavier as I considered it. One night, Lorenzo sat across from me and tapped the sonnet as if testing the tone of my spine. "You make people see," he said. "Sometimes they should remain unblinking," I answered. He smiled, a small, almost reluctant thing. "Never smile for someone else's poison." "You already told me that," I said. I had said it before, and I'd written it down. The napkin had become a rule book and a memory. "Then, keep it close," he said. "You'll need it where we're going." He did not tell me what he was going to do next, only that there would be a gala, that there would be a museum fundraiser, that names I could not yet pronounce would cross paths over very old chairs. He spoke of a box in the house where a man like Rustanovsky might sit, and his voice narrowed on the word like a sightline. "We go to the museum," he said. "We watch. You will be my translator. You will be the woman who stands in front of power and names the small things." When the words left his mouth, the world shrank into a point I could no longer see around. Being the woman who translated meant stepping back into the light in a way that would make me vulnerable to Hawk, to politicians, to the city itself. It meant choosing a side. I felt the napkin in my pocket like a pulse. The 5 words were an anchor and a warning. They had begun as a private directive to a stranger, and had become a way of navigating a world that wanted me either invisible or complicit. Neither option felt like freedom. They left the sonnet on the lectern that night. Lorenzo closed the book halfway through a line about mercy and set his hand upon it, his fingers resting like a map on terrain he knew well. Outside the window, the river moved like a ribbon of coins. Inside, the penthouse smelled of cedar and lemon oil and the sharp kind of courage that arrives when you have nothing left to bargain with but your observation. I folded the napkin thinner and slid it back into my pocket. The word stayed with me like an ember. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. The decision sat between my ribs like something foreign and familiar. I had no idea then how many lives such a small sentence could reconfigure. But that night, with the sonnet's half line in the river like a seam, I let it be my compass. The dress fit like a truth I had not yet learned to own. It slipped along my skin with the ease of a secret being told the right way, never shouted, always leaned into. Miss Petrova chose it for me. Eyes running down the cut and back up as if cataloging what it would and would not reveal. It was black, but the black had a blue undercurrent that only showed when I moved. The shoes were low and sensible. The plan required ankles that could flee as fast as a conversation could sour. Lorenzo preferred a quiet, elegant. He wore a suit cut to silence. No loud pinstripe, his cuff glinted when he reached for my wrist to check the bracelet's tag. The click had become less of a lock and more of an index. It told them where I was supposed to be. We flew across the city in a car that hummed like a contained heartbeat. The museum's glass facade reflected a sky the color of old money. The gala had that smell museums acquire when they pretend to be more sacred than a bank. Citrus air fresheners trying to outrun the perfume, the soft scratch of programs being opened and folded. People wore loyalty like lapel pins. I wore my translated lines in my head, sentences smoothed for whoever would hear them. Lorenzo called them bridges, little linguistic spans to keep conversations from splintering into dangerous forks. "Remember the napkin?" he said once, when the car slid through a gap in traffic and the city breathed past us. "Don't drink it, smile and leave." Now I had written it for someone else. Now it was an instruction I had to make my own. We entered through a service door. "Miss Petrova," whispered our cover. I was a translator for a visiting cultural attaché, something polite and technical that meant I would stand near an open salute and not attract undue attention. Franco and Kale would seat themselves at discrete points, Franco where he could see the stage, Kale where he could watch the exits. Lorenzo arranged his people like a gambler, lays his odds close to comfort, always between me and the easied egress. Inside, The main hall smelled of varnished wood and old varnish. The chandeliers were theatrical in a way that made you feel the past pressing down like a hand. My role required a small white earpiece that fit into the revolve of my ear and a script with sentences I had practiced until they sounded like my own name. I felt a small, private nausea as I clipped the earpiece in. It was my throat's way of protesting the risk. They seated me near a private box where Alexander Rustanovsky had accepted an invitation. He was not supposed to be important to me beyond an entry on a ledger. Yet there he was, leaning back in a chair that looked like a throne assembled from tasteful regret. I had seen him before on a newsfeed that spoke of civic valor and ribbon. Up close, he looked like a man coated in the polite oils of compromised hands that had been washed, but not enough. Beside him was a woman whose smile had been refurbished by a surgeon's precise patience. Politicians hire people like that. Smiles fixed so citizens will not notice how the fingers move. I watched as people performed civility. I watched the waitress carrying champagne trays move like a row of attended instruments. The room had noise, and also a humming current of meaning. Somewhere in that current a broker like Silas Hawke moves with scissors and thread. He cuts a line here, sews another there, watches the garments of power rearrange until something fits his hand. My earpiece fed me small phrases as the speeches progressed, transitions, thanking of patrons, nods toward donors. I repeated them into my throat and made them sound like translation rather than performance. By the second course, my voice had the hollow quality of a person who works with words for a living. Lorenzo sat beside me. A quiet wait. We were in a room designed to hold strangers at a comfortable angle. It was a theater of alliances. Conversations were whispered like wagers. Men and women shifted position in the room, and with each small move, the room altered its trajectory. I kept my eyes on a pattern like a seismograph. Rustanovsky's hands, a server's knee brushing a tablecloth, a shadow behind an ornate column. We had a plan built from invoices and hunches. That Hawke would use Rustanovsky as a conduit. That a transfer disguised as philanthropy would be the breadcrumb to the ledger. That a man in an accessory ring watch cuff would betray a familiarity too precise for coincidence. It is the small things, the humans who leave habits in their wake, who make conspiracies bleed into evidence. An invoice misworded, a courier who writes tie limited when the proper shorthand would be tie limited, a finger that always adjusts a cuff at the same moment a photograph is taken. These are not dramas. They are openings. I saw Hawke before I could hear the name. He was a craft of presentation, handsome in a way that had been polished and then sanded down to be presentable in any mirror. He moved like a man who had been trained to be seen right at the edges, to be just visible enough to be plausible. He had a companion who wore an old theater coat. They laughed in small ticked bursts, like people who know how to keep their voices low. From a ledger we'd traced, Hawke favored private boxers and later rivals, men who liked to sign things and forget them. The first sign that the plan might work arrived in the form of a program left carelessly on Rustanovsky's knee. I watched a server's hand brush it as she adjusted a ribbon. The program slid and showed an Adon Art Patron's stone plaque, a benefactor we had tracked back to a phantom company. Franco was a shadow in the balcony. Kale was a shadow by the exit. I felt the earpieces whisper like a second heartbeat. Move. Watch. Count. At the interlude, a man in a dark suit leaned in to Rustanovsky, and in a voice like a zipper, offered a compliment about a recent donation. Rustanovsky smiled with the smile of someone who accepts praise like a bridge he had personally brokered. The man's ring a thin band with a slit like the one I'd seen at the bar glinted for the space of a breath. The whisper went through me like cold water. The same glyph. It was a signature Hawke, used the way some men use a business card. We pivoted. Franco descended like an explanation. Kale eased the exit route. Miss Petrova slid toward Rustanovsky in a way that looked like a charming minister of logistics. Lorenzo remained still, a dark pillar. He had chosen to be visible in minimal ways. His presence was a pressure, not a performance. Hawke's eyes skimmed mine like a trial balloon. He had the sort of look that is meant to gauge danger without committing to it. He was careful in the way birds are careful near netting. He laughed at the right moments. He touched his ring twice, an unconscious act of comfort. That was the kind of motion you can use to tie a man to a coin. Then, the plan stalled. It was not a messy failure. Hawk's operation was not a blunt instrument that breaks under pressure. It was a mere game. In the space of a minute, the man who had approached Rustanovsky stepped away and rustled the program into his pocket. A second man in actor. A decoy we'd not seen crossed into the line of sight and adjusted his glove. Cameras caught a reflection where there had been none. The ledger's breadcrumb had been picked up by a man who understood breadcrumb trails. Whoever covered Hawk's movements had planned for the possibility of a ledger being traced. We had not expected the theater of decoys. Lorenzo's jaw flexed. He had planned for noise. He had not planned for the errors in timing that allowed misdirection to flower into opportunity for Hawk. A man had left the room wearing our program. A courier had been signaled and walked out at a certain time with a certain gait. We watched men like players in a sport they practiced daily. It felt like betrayal, but it was not betrayal. It was a more human form of preparedness. Hawk had woven a rope and then had taught someone else to swing it. That night, for the first time in months, I felt the strain of being used for something larger than my skills. It is a peculiar thing to know. You can read people like lines on a page and then find that the page has been folded and a word hidden. Useful is one thing, expendable is another. I slept badly with that distinction humming in my bones. The failure tightened the net rather than unspooled it. We had a new lead. A courier with a memory for faces who wore a particular cologne and who had been seen in an inexpensive bodega by the river. We traced him to a storage unit where men keep the things they cannot inscribe into public life. There we found a cache of programs and a crate labeled in a courier's hand with a name that matched a shell company connected to a registered donation. It was enough to at least give movement to the case. I found myself staying up late, cross-referencing dates with the small patience of someone building a mosaic. I dug into the mistyped invoices and the stamps that bled through the edges. People make mistakes. A man who types a company name with a casual apostrophe is someone who does not recheck his work. That kind of human carelessness was our doorway to Hawk. Meanwhile, Anthony's small tragedy unraveled further. He had been used as an access point and then repurposed as a tool. I received a photograph of a thin paper stack that showed a bank address scratched out and rewritten in a child's hand. It was his handwriting, his attempt to hide the break. He had not been a villain in the classic sense. He was an error born of necessity that now had to be repurposed into fuel for a larger machine. I did not rub my hands with satisfaction. I felt a low, persistent ache that settled near my liver. Lorenzo watched me with a patience that was not always kind. He knew what I was beginning to feel before I did. I think he called it preemption. The recognition that if you wait to feel the moral effects of what you do, they will grow teeth and bite. He liked clean edges. He liked decisions made quickly. That is a useful talent if you are in a line of work where hesitation can melt intentions into ruin. He offered me a choice that was not a choice at all. Continue as the instrument that made them visible, or step aside and let them hire someone else. The second option was a strange kind of exile, disappear back into the bar and accept that the city could still send men with rings to poison strangers. The first option was to lean in, to learn their languages and use mine to pull threads. I realized then that usefulness is a career with a moral ledger. You accept payments in information and paid debts with silence. You keep your name tucked away like a paid tab in a booth and hope it does not get reopened. I chose to keep opening. A night passed in which Lorenzo and I sat in the penthouse library with the sonnet open and the river folding light into a gleam. He read a line aloud and I followed. I do not know how people fall into one another when the terms are not equal. Perhaps there is no recipe. I know only that the sonnet gave us a vocabulary for what we could not say. His voice had a grain in it that wasn't there when he commanded rooms. There were tenderness and a roughness, like a man who had learned to make his affections scarce. When he reached for me, there was a hesitation, like a room noticing a light. I did not pull away. That would have been a ritual of independence that felt performative instead of honest. We did not speak of consent in the way used in agencies and courts. We spoke with the nearest language we had. temperature and breath and the small pressure of hand against wrist. When we crossed the line of touch, it was consensual and also complicated by the fact that he was the one who held the keys to my old life. That complication lived with us as a shadow. It was not a romantic equation with a neat solution. It was a not. Afterwards, we lay with the sonnet between us. His fingers found the line he'd paused on, and he traced the print with a thumb that smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. "You can say no," he said, not as a plea, but as a manual for someone who wanted to locate the correct tool. "I can," I said, meaning it in the immediate moment but not making a guarantee for what future pressure would do to my resolve. That is how intimacy with power feels. Consent measured in moments rather than commitments. I do not romanticize it. I register it as a fact. The moral calculus is a private ledger I kept folded under the napkin with the 5 words. We pressed forward, more careful, and also more dangerous. My name began to appear in notes as translator and observer, and my presence in events became expected. Lorenzo's people escorted me, introduced me, smoothed wrinkles away with an economy of motion. I was both protected and under a glass. There is a pressure to perform gratitude when someone keeps you alive and a different pressure when that someone becomes a context of your life. Hawk responded to pressure with the sort of loose violence that is refined into art. He moved a piece of information into the public sphere. A rumor about a politician paying for protection. Rostanovsky's aides were suddenly defensive. The newspapers, smelling blood, sniffed at the margins. We had evidence, but not certainty. It is easier to mobilize legal systems when there is a clear picture. We had shadows and smudged frames. The decisive moment arrived the night. A charity dinner moved into late hours. A courier with a ledger we had been tracking moved past a valet and into the back room. He was a man with a recall for faces who had worked for too many bosses to be naive. We had watched him for days. He wanted to believe that there were people who could hold the world steady. He believed in small favors being repaid. He carried a small box that smelled faintly of cedar. Inside, a courier had placed a set of plaques donor acknowledgments that would be published and used as evidence. Among them, tucked like a confession, was a receipt with a scratch in the margin that matched Anthony's handwriting. The paper's crease was old. It had been folded the way someone hides something but fears losing it. We had the breadcrumb, and this time we did not scramble. Franco ordered the move. Cale slipped through the service door with the quiet certainty of men who do not ask permission. We cornered the courier inside a service corridor that smelled of steam and batteries. He had been taught to be small in public and dangerous behind closed doors. When we stepped into his shadow, he swallowed the last of his courage and tried to bargain. Men like him believe they are always bargaining when the right people step in. Bargaining is, to them, a structure of survival. The courier talked. He was small and old with the city in his joints. He mentioned names I'd already seen on ledgers. He said Hawk had recently upped his hospitality budget with a donor who could not be traced unless he angled for the small mistakes. Misspelled company names, invoices routed through courier addresses, a transfer that included the word private where no private account existed. He said Hawk preferred to use misdirection. A string of donations donated then rescinded, as if the money were a rumor rather than a thing. It is the human error, the fat thumb that hits a wrong key that unravels clandestine webs. The courier's story gave us enough threads to begin pulling. We set a trap, the way men set a line, with delicate bait. Lorenzo arranged a meeting that Hawk could not resist, an offer of anonymity for a large sum, a deal he could not refuse without revealing his hand. Lorenzo's people used Anthony's knowledge as an anchor. Anthony called in favors he no longer had the right to call in but did anyway. It was a gamble. Put a man who had already been compromised in the path of a broker whose favorite trick was to use human guilt as a weapon. The night of the rendezvous. I stood in the grove of the underpass where the city pockets its secrets and watched 2 men approached from either side. Hawk wore a neutral coat and a hat that shadowed his face. His movement was precise. The courier placed the ledger on the bench like an offering. Anthony stood a few steps back, hands like someone who had learned a script and hoped the lines were accurate. I had rehearsed my role until it sat in my mouth like a comfortable lie. I watched Hawk open the ledger and ripple through a small set of names. There, scrawled across a margin, was a column in which someone had mistyped the Shell Company. Hawk's eyes moved. He had not expected the book to have such markings. He touched the corner with a finger that had never before held a pen. For a man who trades in certainty, a misspelled company is a crack you can pry open. Lorenzo was behind me like a shadow returned. He did not move to strike. He moved to frame. He wanted the man to walk into a place where he could be revealed, but not privately disposed of. It was, in a perverse way, the city's law. Take what you can prove and put it on the table. Lorenzo is not a man who worships law. He worships the ability to make things transparent enough that other people cannot pretend they were not complicit. Hawk smiled like someone who thought the room belonged to him. He had this sort of charm that, if placed in the proper gallery, would look like culture. His face said the right things. That he had been surprised, disarmed, amused. You shouldn't have used that ledger, Lorenzo said softly. Who are you to ask me what I should have done? Hawk asked, smiling like a cat that has found a ring around the moon. I'm the man who pays the final bills, Lorenzo replied. That is how conversation becomes an act. A man of words said fewer than any other in that exchange, but the fewer he said, the louder they rang. Hawk tried to walk away. He was a man comfortable with the idea that you can step around consequences. He believed in running, in the city's generous capacity to let men slide where signatures are ambiguous. But a ledger is a legal animal in some lights. It can be turned into a witness if you know how to translate its script. Franco moved to block the alley. Cale sealed the other. The courier tried to vanish into a gap, but the city's architecture wraps around certain movements and traps them like fish in an eddy. Hawk's companion, noticing the shift, reached for her phone. Alexei snatched it from her hand. For a broker who sells illusions, the reality of being handled by people who have no interest in bargaining is a sharp thing. They told Hawk they would prefer to handle this through exposure. They would bring cameras, lawyers, auditors, a public release that would make his transactions into headlines instead of whispers. Hawk laughed at the threat. Some men laugh because the sound is practiced and the truth is a different animal, but as the night bent, as the ledger's breadcrumbs became incontrovertible, Hawk's laughter shrank. He was not a man who embraced martyrdom. He chose then to run, to try to use speed as a defense. He moved quick and considered. He held a small dossier in his Honda packet of receipts and a business card that smelled faintly of lemon oil. He made for a car. Someone in the street shouted. The chase that followed had the ingredients of a film. Lights, steel, men running like stories with legs. They caught him at the river's edge. He did not fight with the sort of savage refusal that makes men dangerous. He fought with a kind of slick politeness, pleas for negotiations, for his life, for the survival of a business model. He offered information in drips like a man saving currency. Lorenzo listened to his pleas with the same attention he used to read sonnets. Patience, the position of a man who knows the cadence. Hawk offered names that made the ledger look like a footnote. He named intermediaries who were so far removed from the money that they had plausible deniability. He named a politician who had indeed received a donation that matched a check in the ledger. He named a man who had insurance debts paid off by an anonymous account. When he spoke of Rustanovsky, his voice changed. He sought to paint the politician as a man who had strayed into favor with a broker, a man who did not understand that being near certain benefactors requires a form of hygiene. We did not arrest Rustanovsky that night. We exposed a rumor. We held Hawk under a series of light questions built to reveal more than a man intended. The ledger was seized. Anthony's role was recognized as coerced rather than voluntary. The moral calculus shifted. For a man who had been cornered by debt, the law had a thinner blade. Anthony had already paid by the way the ledger's blood had been pressed into his hands. He had done what he could, and then he had been used as a means. We brought Hawk to a room where Lorenzo could speak to him like a prosecutor who has the weight of the city behind his silence. Lorenzo turned the man over to an independent prosecutor with the threat of exposure if charges were not adequately applied. The idea was not justice in the abstract sense. It was an attempt to make wrongdoing visible in a world that specializes in making it invisible. Hawk scrabbled for the old safety of being able to trade in favors, and remove people from maps. A man whose business is to make things disappear finds that the world has grown reluctant to forget. The fallout was not instant. A ledger becomes a magazine of implications. Names will be called, lawyers will bargain, whispers will escalate into columns. Rostanovsky reacted like all men do when a scent of doom pushes into the air. He denied, he blamed, he reshaped the narrative. The press smelled the story and did what the press does. They split the night into headlines and left the work of consequence to men with gloves. And in the middle of all that, I watched my own reflection adjust. I had become someone who could move through halls and read the small weaknesses like weather. The city now measured me in degrees I did not always like. Was I a survivor? Was I a collaborator? Was I someone who had sold her past for a measure of safety? It is easier to ask the question than to answer it. Anthony's fate was the least neat thing we managed. He was not a saint nor a monster. He was a man who had been forced to make choices under a pressure that will not rest easily on a conscience. He agreed to testify against Hawk in exchange for reduced charges. The legal system I had never trusted behaved like a machine for swapping scenes for paperwork. He did this not because he was brave, but because he had been offered a way to keep his sister's life from unraveling. The city loves that kind of calculus. One life adjusted to keep another working. I visited him once before the testimony. He looked older than his age, slower with laughter, as if he had burned the edges off jokes. He apologized more in his hands than with words. There was nothing noble about his apology. It sounded like a machine being wiped of dust. I told him he had done what he could, and that survival is not a clean ledger. He wept a small sound and then steadied himself. It was, in its way, as human as anything I've seen in the rooms of men who arrange power. The press seized Hawk's arrest and began to look for a deeper connection. They could not find Rostanovsky implicated in anything criminal in law's neat sense. But in the court of public opinion, a man will be judged for things that are not formally prosecuted. Rostanovsky, in the face of rumor, hired lawyers and provided statements that said little. He disavowed knowledge. He claimed plausible ignorance. In the world where men assign their hands to others, plausible ignorance is a magic trick. Lorenzo's decision was a political maneuver. He wanted the ledger public enough to make the people who'd thought themselves untouchable less bold. But he did not want to tear the city down to satisfying a personal itch for vengeance. Hawks could be hunted, yes, but they also serve functions. The city relies on the brokerage of favors to settle things that cannot be processed by courts. Lorenzo understood currency in a way I was still learning. He wanted leverage, not chaos. He wanted the man to be accountable where it mattered, where his hands had been printed in ink. After Hawk's arrest, the museum's glow dimmed. The city exhaled and then inhaled in new rhythms. Men called favors back. Politicians made public statements. Old friends came forward to take sides. The ledger was turned into a skeleton of proof, and in its bones we could see a map of who touched whom and why. The cost for me was a quiet unpicking. I had tried to live by a rule folded into napkin paper. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. But the world had not stayed comfortable with the choice I had made. The napkin had multiplied into a philosophy I had to apply in places it did not fit neatly. There were nights I found myself walking the streets alone, hands in pockets, thinking about a customer who had laughed and then left his glass. Had I saved him, or had I set off a chain that caused others to get hurt? The napkin's 5 words were moral currency. They multiplied into a ledger that did not have enough columns. In the quiet of one late night, Lorenzo asked me a question in a way that felt like a test and an offering. If you wanted to leave, he said, you could go. The offer had the weight of a door left open and the whisper of a trap. He said it because he knew the best way to locate someone's will is to offer them an exit and watch if they take it. I looked at him and saw a man who had built an empire on the quickness of decision. He had chosen me for reasons he did not fully explain, because I had seen, because I had stuck a napkin like a flag, because sometimes a small, unassuming person becomes a good scout. I don't think I can go back to the same life, I said, and I don't think I want to be kept as a curio. He gave the smallest smile, the one that inched at the corner of his mouth, like an apology. Then, be neither. Be useful in the ways you choose. Not as a thing to be displayed, but as a person who knows how to move. It was not a promise of freedom. It was a framework. I had the strange sensation that I was stepping onto a bridge. that had been constructed out of calculated choices rather than out of affection. Months passed. The city rearranged itself into new rhythms of secrecy and revelation. Hawke's prosecution moved forward on the ledger's strength, using Anthony's testimony and the courier's indiscretion as the bones of the case. Rustanovsky weathered the press storms with the surgeonly care of a man whose team knows how to stitch up scandal. The Orpheum recovered. Marco's name sank beneath the surface and became a soddenness people only spoke of in rare, private moments. I kept the napkin folded in the same pocket, the edges softened. I pressed my thumbnail into the corner sometimes, as if feeling the paper might remind me where my edges were. Lorenzo and I kept the rituals of our arrangement. Sonnets on quiet nights, moments of tenderness, and the usual practicalities of power menus, appointments, security briefs. There was a strange comfort in the rhythms. There was also an ache. The ache lived in the way I noticed certain things: the angle of a person's foot when they lied, the stalling of a conversation when danger was near. I had not expected to find a measure of companionship in a man like him. I had not expected to find that my body would answer to someone who personified a certain kind of danger. I had not expected that his protective insistence could be both a shelter and a cage. I had not expected the moral landscape to be painted with grays that never quite blended. The city continued to bleed stories. People returned to their lives with the sort of caution one grows into after weather. I worked as Lorenzo's translator, and sometimes as his confidential observer at events that required discretion. My name began to hold weight in rooms where it used to be invisible. Strangers sometimes turned to me seeking favors. Others regarded me with suspicion. I learned to field both with curiosity. The napkin's rule continued to be my meter. It was a phrase I used when evaluating choices rather than a hero's creed. A man offers you a drink. I thought, do you take it because you trust him, or because you can afford the risk? There are more complicated things than poison. There are offers that sound like salvation and are actually snares. There are men who will give you a name and a wardrobe and a fortress and quietly take your past in exchange. Once, in a moment, when the city had quieted and the river gleamed like a strip of silver thread, I unfolded the napkin and read the words as if they had been a map. Don't drink it, smile, and leave now. I thought about how it had been written to save one man and had become a philosophy that shaped the fates of several. I thought about the awkward calculus that decides whether you bend to survive or break. I cannot say I regret the choice. Regret would be too neat a thing. What I have are facts and memory. I saw Marco's hands in moments of guilt. I stood with Anthony when he sat in a witness chair and watched his voice break into apologies. I watched Hawke led away with a look that pretended to be surprised, and I saw the way his eyes scanned for an exit he no longer had. I measure my nights by where I placed my feet and whose footprints I allowed myself to follow. At times, the weight of being seen pressed down on me in new ways. People with power have a habit of turning people who help them into ornaments. Lorenzo did not do this often. He preferred to keep my function useful, to treat my skills like a sharp tool rather than a statue. Yet there were times when his possessiveness shaded into something unhealthier. He liked to mark me subtly. A comment in private, a look across a room, a line of text in a contract he had his people draw that made my life more comfortable, and also more enmeshed with his. You belong to a city that wants tidy outcomes, he said once. And you want tidy outcomes too, I replied. His fingers spread, collecting the space between us like a map. I want to ensure the city doesn't eat people who haven't been trained to fight back, he said. I understood the sentiment. I also knew how easy it is to mistake protection for ownership. There was a night when I thought about leaving again, not because I believed there was a clear door, but because sometimes you need to test the seam between survival and captivity. I walked to the edge of the river and watched boats slice the light. The napkin in my pocket warmed against the denim. I thought about Chloe, about friends who had not been drawn into the thread of my life and who still had the luxury of a past uninstrumentalized by power. They felt like ghosts who sometimes waved at me from a life I had once pretended to want. Lorenzo found me there. He did not touch me immediately. He stood a step away like a man making sure he had permission to cross into private territory. He watched me, watching the water. I could let you go, he said softly, like making an offer he scarcely expected to be accepted. Could you? I asked. He shrugged, as much as someone like him could shrug. Do you think you would leave? There are questions that are less about desire and more about identity. I had been invisible longer than I had been seen. It takes a kind of courage to leave safety, not for freedom, but for the unknown. I did not know if I was brave enough to risk the life Lorenzo had rebuilt for me. I did not know if I could bear the nightmare of the city revisiting me with threats now that I had a name and a ledger. In the end, the answer is not neat. The choice I made felt like a compromise between being a thing under glass and being a person who can aim. I stayed. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because I had work to do, and because I had not yet found a way to be both free and useful. I told myself it was a temporary calculus. I told myself I would someday find a way to separate the page of my life from the ink of his. Weeks later, the public hearings began. The ledger's names circulated like townsfolk at a fair. Rustanovsky made statements. Hawk's defense tried to minimize his involvement. Anthony testified in a voice that strained between shame and survival. The world watched as documents grew into accusations. People in buttoned jackets made decisions that would determine the course of careers and reputations. The legal theater is a slow and certain animal. It is not the quickness of a knife but the persistence of a winter that wears down stone. Hawk pled guilty to several counts, where the ledger made his guilt hard to deny. Rustanovsky faced questions about donations and retreats he had accepted without checking their provenance. The city rearranged, and the rearrangement created room for new politics. For months, people clattered about in small ways lawsuits, quiet resignations, a charity dissolving its board. The ripples were not revolutionary, they were practical. That, too, is a kind of justice, the kind that cleans a wound without pretending to heal it entirely. In the quieter times, when the sonnet would lay open, and Lorenzo's hand would hover over a line, I practiced reading the world in the way I had always done. 4 edges, for the smell of bleach on napkins, for the way a man moves his fingers when he hides a receipt. I learned to be aggressive in observation, without losing the softness that made me human. I also learned to hold my pity and my complicity in the same space without pretending they could be reconciled. And then, months after the arrest, a small thing happened that made the napkin's instruction return as if a bell had been rung. I was behind a bar in Old Haunt where I kept a name that allowed me to feel A man sat down and ordered vodka in crystal. He had the practiced smile. There was a glitter of ring on his finger, not the ancient keyhole glyph we'd traced, but a copy, perhaps, or a man who had learned to mimic that which he admired. As I poured, my fingers moved on their own. I reached for a napkin and wrote those same 5 words, the line that had once started this chain of events. I slid it across, the paper soft, with travel. He smiled, looked at the napkin, and left. It was small and ordinary, and given to the city like a polite gesture. No more bombs, no more ledgers. Just a man who, perhaps, reconsidered. The napkin remained folded in my pocket like an old truth. I cannot tell you what the future holds. I can tell you how the choices imbric it. A napkin, a ring, a sonnet, the city takes and reassigns. Men like Lorenzo create rules for their worlds and expect you to follow them because they can shape the air. I live with both the comfort and the suffocation of that arrangement. I have a name now. People call me to translate and to observe and to make visible what others prefer hidden. That is a power and also a burden. The napkin's rule is not a moral law. It is a pragmatic one. It asks you, in 5 small words, to refuse a common practice that could cost you everything. It warns you to protect yourself. It asks you to choose whether to stay where your life is comfortable and invisible, or to become a person who accepts the cost of safety. For me, it became a map and a question. If you ever find yourself with a drink you do not trust, maybe you'll remember to smile and leave now. Maybe you'll write a small note on a napkin. Maybe you'll fold it in your pocket and carry it like a talisman. I have learned that survival is both pedestrian and profound. It is the small choices made in the interval between breath and reaction. It is the tiny acts of not drinking, of warning a stranger, of keeping a ledger that ripple outward in unexpected ways. It is also the acceptance that you will be asked to pay for your safety with things you might have once called parts of yourself. The city's river keeps moving. Lorenzo and I keep reading sonnets. Anthony moved through his consequences and lives with the knowledge that sometimes you must be small to save someone you love. Hawk sits in a cell where he has time to think about the economy of favors. Marco's name is a small ache in my memory. The napkin is a tool, a philosophy, a warning. I keep mine in my pocket. It is a folded rule that has made a history out of a night. It is a reminder that some dangers are poured like single droplets into crystal, and that sometimes the right response is as simple as a smile and the steady motion of leaving. If you want to follow along with more stories like this, one stories that watch the city and name the small things that make us bend, there's a playlist you can come back to. I folded the napkin again and slid it into the back of the drawer. The sonnet waited on the lectern. The river shone like the edge of a coin. Outside, someone laughed in a way that sounded like a transaction. I lit a cigarette I did not plan to finish. Because the habit was mine, and because habits help you map the time between one danger and the next. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. It is both a warning and an instruction. It saved a man once and shaped a life of consequences. It taught me that being invisible is survival, but being seen can be power if you are willing to pay for it.